The smell reached him before the sound did. Not cordite, not diesel. Something older, something the jungle had been holding since before any of them arrived. Wet earth and crushed grass and the particular stillness that falls over a place in the seconds before it stops being quiet forever. Lieutenant Colonel John Vessey stood at the edge of the fire direction center and breathed it in without knowing why. Then the mortars started. 600 rounds in the first few minutes, and the smell was gone, replaced by everything else. John Wesley Vessey Jr. was 34 years old, from St. Paul, Minnesota, and he had been a soldier since he was 17, since the Army gave a teenager with no money and no plan both. He had fought at Anzio as an enlisted man before most of the men under his command were born. He had climbed every rank the artillery offered. On the morning of March 21, 1967, he commanded the 2nd Battalion, 77th Field Artillery, at Fire Support Base Gold, 17 miles northwest of Tay Ninh, in War Zone C. He had his guns. He had his men. What he did not yet have was any idea how close both were to being gone. At 0630, an ambush patrol made contact with a large force moving toward the base from the tree line. Within minutes, 600 mortar rounds were falling on Gold. Vessey did not know yet that 5 enemy battalions, 2,500 men, were already moving. He would understand what that number meant in approximately 40 minutes. If you are watching this, you already understand that military history is not about hardware or body counts. It is about the men who held their positions when positions were not supposed to hold. This channel exists to tell those stories with the accuracy they deserve and the respect they earned. Not every name appears in the history books, but every name mattered. Subscribe now and join the people who refuse to let these moments disappear into footnotes. The story of Firebase Gold deserves to be heard. So do the men who were there.
He enlisted at 17 because there was no other obvious path forward. St. Paul, Minnesota, in the late 1940s was not unkind to an ambitious young man, but ambition alone could not pay tuition, and Vessey had understood from an early age that the life he wanted would not simply appear. The Army offered structure, purpose, and for a teenager who had read enough history to know that the world was not safe, the chance to be genuinely useful. He got his war sooner than he expected. As a 17-year-old private, John Wesley Vessey Jr. landed at Anzio, Italy in January 1944, one of the bloodiest and most chaotic amphibious landings of the Second World War. He was not old enough to vote. He was old enough to watch men die in the sand beside him, in the wet cold of an Italian winter, and old enough to understand that the difference between the living and the dead was often nothing more than timing, the man beside you, and a choice made in a fraction of a second that no training could fully prepare you for. He survived Anzio. He stayed in the Army. Over the next 2 decades, Vessey rose through every rank the artillery branch offered. Not because of connections or family name, he had neither, but because he was the kind of officer that men followed without needing to be ordered. He understood artillery the way a craftsman understands a tool he has spent a lifetime carrying. Not just the mechanics, but the feel of it. The calculation of angles under pressure. The particular discipline required to serve a weapon whose effects you cannot observe from where you stand. He had also developed an understanding that most artillery commanders knew only theoretically. What happens when the distance closes? When the enemy is no longer across the valley? When the guns must become something they were never designed to be? By March 1967, Vessey had been a soldier for 20 years. He had a wife at home. two daughters he thought about every morning before the radio started. He kept a small notebook in his chest pocket. Coordinates, fire missions, the working shorthand of a man who had spent his career thinking in trajectories and angles. He never went anywhere without that notebook. It was in the way that tools carried long enough become extensions of the person carrying them, the most personal object he owned in this country. He also carried something less tangible, a conviction he had formed when he first took command of the battalion. Not a formal oath, not something he had said aloud, just a certainty that had settled into him the way convictions do after 20 years in uniform. Every man goes home, whatever it takes. That conviction had never been tested at close range, not until now. Fire Support Base Gold sat 17 miles northwest of Tay Ninh, inside the stretch of jungle and scrubland the Army called War Zone C, Viet Cong territory, a logistical corridor running along the Cambodian border that the enemy had used for years, and that the Americans had been trying to break open since the early days of major troop commitment. Operation Junction City, launched in February 1967, was the largest American military operation of the war to that point. 17 field artillery battalions, airborne assaults, mechanized sweeps across an area the Viet Cong had treated as a sanctuary for a decade. Gold was a key node in that fire support network. 3 American battalions in the surrounding jungle depended on Vessey's guns. If Gold went silent, those men would be fighting without a safety net. He understood the stakes with the clarity that comes from having done the calculations personally. Artillery in Vietnam was not a supplement. It was a structural necessity, particularly in terrain where air support was weather-dependent and medevac could be delayed. Vessey had reviewed his ammunition inventory the night before. He had positioned his guns at optimized points around the perimeter. He had done everything that planning could do. What happened next would be beyond planning. What Vessey did not know, what no intelligence report had confirmed with precision, was that the 272nd Viet Cong Regiment had been watching Gold for days. 5 full battalions, approximately 2,500 fighters, had spent the preceding nights mapping the perimeter in small groups, moving through the jungle, identifying sectors, memorizing patrol patterns and shift changes. They had chosen to attack in daylight, which was almost unprecedented for Viet Cong main force units. Daylight meant air support, helicopter gunships, tactical aircraft that could arrive within minutes. The 272nd commanders had made a calculation. The sheer volume of the assault, 5 battalions hitting simultaneously from multiple directions, would overwhelm Gold before effective air support could be coordinated. They were not wrong to believe this. They had done the mathematics. The mathematics were in their favor. The notebook in his chest pocket had one entry he had never shared with anyone. Not a coordinate, not a fire mission, but his oldest daughter's name, written at the top of the first page in his own hand, years before he arrived in Vietnam. He had never explained it to anyone. He had never needed to. Stories like this one do not survive in official histories the way they should. They survive because people who were there, or who loved someone who was, choose to pass them on. This channel exists to preserve those stories with the accuracy and respect they deserve. If you served with an artillery unit in Vietnam, or if someone in your family did, the comment section below is not just a space for words. It is where those experiences find a second life. Tell us their names. Tell us what the guns sounded like from inside the wire. Add your story below. In the jungle west of Firebase Gold, on the night before the assault, the men of the 272nd Viet Cong Regiment went through their final preparations in silence and darkness. We know this from captured documents and from the discipline and coordination that characterized the assault itself. They had rehearsed the attack for days, moving through the jungle at night in small groups, identifying perimeter sectors, learning the terrain between their assembly positions and the wire. They were, by any honest assessment, skilled soldiers. The 272nd had been fighting, first against the French, then against the Americans and their South Vietnamese allies, for the better part of 2 decades. Its fighters were not conscripts dragged into a war they did not understand. They were professionals, shaped by years of irregular warfare and political commitment, who believed, with reason, that this fight was theirs to win. The regiment's senior leadership had made a calculated decision when they chose to attack in daylight. Every conventional military instinct argued against it. Daylight attacks exposed assault forces to air support, to helicopter gunships, to the kind of coordinated response that gave defenders an enormous advantage. But the calculation had been specific. 5 battalions hitting simultaneously from 3 directions would generate so much chaos so quickly that effective air coordination would be impossible before the base was overrun. The leadership had studied similar operations. They had examined the numbers. They were not reckless men. They were professionals who had concluded that the window was real and that the cost of attempting it was acceptable given what success would mean. Each squad had been given a specific objective. Each platoon knew the sequence. They moved to their assault positions before first light with the patience of men who have learned to treat time as a weapon. They were human beings with lives on the other side of this war. Most of them had not seen their families in months. Some had young children whose names they recited silently on long marches through the jungle the way a rosary works, not for God, but for the anchor of something specific waiting on the other side of survival. They believed in what they were fighting for, with a depth of commitment that deserved acknowledgement regardless of the uniform they were wearing. The political officer who addressed them the night before was not wrong when he told them this fight was meaningful. They believed it. Whatever the outcome of the morning, that belief was real. For the defenders inside Gold, the stakes were immediate and cascading. The perimeter was held by 1 infantry battalion operating below full strength, and 1 artillery battalion whose crews were trained to fight at distance, not at close range. 3 American battalions in the surrounding jungle depended on Vessey's guns for fire support. If the artillery went silent, if the base was overrun or the guns were destroyed, those battalions would lose their primary fire support during active operations in terrain where visibility was measured in meters. The chain of consequences would extend upward through brigade, division, and 2 field force to the command level where the credibility of Junction City itself was being assessed. There was also the larger dimension. Junction City was being watched. MACV was reporting its results to the Pentagon, which was reporting them to the White House, which was making claims about the war's trajectory to the American public. A successful, sustained daytime assault on the operation's central fire support base in daylight with 5 battalions overrunning a position that American command had assessed as adequately defended would be a statement beyond its tactical dimensions, not just a setback. A statement about what the war cost and who was paying it, and whether the approach was producing the results that commanders were asserting. Vessey was not a political man, but 20 years in uniform had given him a clear understanding of what battles meant beyond their boundaries. He intended to influence what there was to be meant. He also understood something more personal. The 3 battalions in the jungle trusted Gold the way soldiers trust things they cannot see. The promise of artillery, That somewhere, across the tree line, someone was watching the coordinates and would answer when called, was the kind of promise that made it possible to operate in ground you could not fully control. Vessey had made that promise implicitly by accepting the command. He intended to keep it. By 0620, the patrol outside the wire was reporting contact with a large force moving toward the base from the east and northeast. Vessey listened. He noted the compass bearings. He thought about the Suez Samat, the stream to the south, the uncharted terrain on the other side, the time it would take for an armored relief column to cross unknown ground under fire. The number he calculated was not encouraging. If you have followed this story this far, you already understand something that popular military histories often miss: that the soldiers on both sides of this fight were professionals doing difficult jobs under conditions most of us will never experience, and that honoring their service does not require us to simplify the conflict they were part of. This channel exists to tell those stories honestly, not to glorify the war, but to respect the warriors. If that matters to you, subscribe now and join the community that holds these stories. And hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that honest military history deserves an audience. The ground moved before Vessey fully understood what was happening. Not the sharp concussion of a single round, something deeper, the way Earth responds to sustained impact, a vibration that traveled through the soles of his boots and up through his legs and settled somewhere in his chest. 600 mortar rounds in the first few minutes. He had served artillery long enough to understand the difference between harassing fire and preparatory bombardment, and what he was feeling through the ground was the latter. This was not the enemy trying to disrupt. This was the enemy suppressing, softening, preparing the perimeter for what came behind it. He grabbed the edge of the fire direction center and steadied himself and began giving orders. The sound built in layers. First the mortars, the hollow, distant thump of tubes firing, then the screaming incoming, then the detonations that seemed to swallow the air around them. Then small arms opened up from the tree line, the distinctive clatter of automatic weapons firing simultaneously, hundreds of them. A sound unlike anything a training range produces, because a training range does not produce a sound with human intent behind every round. Then recoilless rifles. Then rocket-propelled grenades, their ignition and their impact separated by just enough time to understand what was coming and not enough time to do anything about it. Then, underneath all of it, the voices of men calling to each other across a perimeter that was trying to absorb everything at once. At 0650, someone at a northeastern bunker transmitted that the tree line was moving. It took a moment for the meaning of that to resolve. The jungle at the edge of Gold's cleared perimeter had been dark and still moments before. Now it was not still. Now there were figures emerging from it. Not a squad, not a platoon, but a mass of fighters that stretched across the entire northeastern sector and kept coming. And the first instinct of every man watching was to disbelieve it, because the numbers their eyes were providing them could not be reconciled with what their training had categorized as a possible assault force. The training had prepared them for a company. What they were seeing was something else. Cordite was the first smell. Then burning wood. The mortar barrage had caught several structures inside the perimeter, and the fires had taken hold in the dry wood of prefabricated walls and roofing materials and supply pallets. Then something that Vessey would later struggle to name with precision: the specific combination of propellant and hydraulic fluid and burning rubber that constitutes the atmospheric signature of a base under sustained attack. Underneath all of it already was the smell the medics understood better than anyone else. Something mineral and warm that the body produces when it is no longer whole. He did not register it consciously. He registered it later, the way the body archives what the mind is too occupied to process. Dust was the first thing he tasted, then smoke. The fires were producing a thin, gray output that the wind was carrying across the fire direction center in sheets, and the smoke made the eyes water and closed the throat incrementally. By 0700, he had been breathing it for 30 minutes, and his mouth tasted like the inside of a spent shell casing, carbon and metal, and a dryness that could not be washed away because there was nothing to wash it away with, and no pause in which to try. He did not stop to address it. He addressed the radio. The fighters of the 272nd Assault Battalions reached the wire on the eastern and northeastern sectors within minutes of the ground attack beginning. They moved through their own suppressive fire, a calculated risk that the assault plan had accepted in exchange for speed. The section leaders kept their men moving, directing them toward the perimeter gaps identified during the preceding nights of reconnaissance. Several Americans fell in those first minutes, killed or wounded by the volume of fire crossing the wire from multiple directions simultaneously. The Viet Cong who reached the eastern bunkers first were not thinking about strategy. They were thinking about the 10 meters in front of them, and the man beside them, and the objective they had rehearsed until it existed in their muscles as much as in their minds. At 0711, a voice came over the radio in the fire direction center, controlled and very quiet, which is how experienced soldiers sound under conditions that warrant the opposite. Company B, Northeast Perimeter, 1st Platoon position overrun, requesting support. Vessey had the solution in his hand before the transmission finished. A trajectory, an elevation, a fuse setting that would place rounds into the enemy's follow-on elements before they could exploit the breach. He passed the orders. The guns fired. And simultaneously he was calculating the next question: whether the perimeter could hold long enough for the relief column to arrive, and whether the relief column had found a way across the Soi Samat, and what he would do with his guns if the answer to either question was no. Inside the breached northeastern sector, American infantrymen and Viet Cong fighters found themselves in the specific kind of close quarters combat that the training manuals describe in clinical language, and that in practice produces a different category of experience entirely. Bunkers that American soldiers had spent days building were now being used as cover by the men who had assaulted them. An artillery reserve force, artillerymen who had been trained on howitzers, not infantry weapons, moved to reestablish the perimeter line on brigade orders. They moved through their own base under direct fire, using the same paths they had used for routine logistics, except that now those paths were contested, and the men on them were being asked to perform a function their training had not fully prepared them for. The Viet Cong assault elements that had breached the northeastern sector did not immediately push toward the artillery positions. This was a deliberate choice built into the assault plan. The artillery was to be isolated first, not immediately overrun, to prevent the guns from being turned on the follow-on waves before they cleared the wire. It was a sophisticated decision. It also gave Vessey something he had not anticipated: 90 additional seconds. In artillery time, 90 seconds is not a pause. It is a fire mission. He used it. He ordered his batteries to shift to direct fire, all of them. Every howitzer with a functional crew and a serviceable breech was to load beehive ammunition, rounds that functioned as giant shotguns, releasing thousands of steel flechettes at muzzle velocity, and engage the advancing assault waves at ranges measured not in kilometers, but in meters. The decision violated standard artillery doctrine about minimum safe distances and fuse settings. The crews executed it anyway. They depressed the barrels toward horizontal. They loaded and fired 30 beehive rounds in a single engagement, 1,000 rounds of combined direct fire. The guns aimed at targets close enough that the crews could see the effect of their own rounds. They did it while structures inside the perimeter were burning. They did it while the northeastern sector was still not fully reestablished. They did it. The effect on the assault wave was immediate and significant. The beehive rounds swept through the open ground between the tree line and the wire and into the breach point, and through the positions the 272nd had taken at enormous cost. The assault wave faltered. Not because the fighters lacked courage. They had already demonstrated courage under conditions that would have broken less disciplined units. But the combination of direct fire artillery, the continuous suppression from the remaining infantry, and the arrival of gunship support overhead created a density of fire that no assault wave could sustain indefinitely. The momentum shifted, barely, but it shifted. Earlier, Vessey had stood at the edge of the fire direction center and breathed in the smell that preceded everything: wet earth, crushed grass, the particular stillness of the jungle before dawn. He had not known then what it was. Now he understood it. The jungle had been absorbing sound, the movement of 2,500 men into their assault positions through the night, the patient discipline of fighters who had learned to move through darkness without making the noise that darkness amplifies. He had been standing at the edge of something enormous without being able to name it. Now he could name it. Now the guns were naming it for both of them. The perimeter was not yet whole, and the armored column had not yet crossed the stream. The gunships arrived at 0745. Their presence changed the sound of the fight. The rhythmic thunder of miniguns operating at a cadence the human ear cannot cleanly process replaced the sustained roar of the ground assault with something that felt, for the first time since 0630, like an answer arriving. The 272nd's assault elements, exposed in the open ground between the tree line and the wire, took severe casualties. Some of the follow-on waves stopped advancing. Some retreated to the tree line. For approximately 15 minutes, the pressure on the perimeter lessened. Inside Gold, men who had been firing continuously for over an hour exhaled. Not completely. There were dead to tend to, a section of the northeastern perimeter still not fully reestablished, and ammunition that needed counting. But the immediate sensation of catastrophe receded slightly, the way pain recedes when you stop moving the thing that is broken. Someone made a joke. Nobody laughed, but nobody told him to stop either, which was its own form of acknowledgement that the worst of the immediate pressure had passed. The notebook in Vessey's chest pocket had blood on the corner of it. It was not his blood. In the 15 minutes of reduced pressure, Vessey pulled his company commanders together by radio and got an accounting. Northeast sector, reestablished, barely at cost. Eastern sector, holding. Ammunition status, adequate for another sustained engagement if the relief column arrived within the hour. He did not have confirmation that the relief column had crossed the Soi Samat. He did not know if it was 10 minutes out or 40 minutes out. What he knew was that 15 minutes of reduced pressure was almost certainly temporary, and that the 272nd would reorganize and attack again. He had enough experience with determined forces to understand that the first assault failing does not mean the second assault is not coming. The problem came from an unexpected direction. Reports from the northeastern sector indicated that a group of Viet Cong fighters had taken cover in a bunker complex near the breach point. They were not advancing. They were using the captured bunkers as a firing position, suppressing the American soldiers who were trying to complete the reestablishment of the perimeter line. To dislodge them, Vessey could call artillery fire on that sector. His guns could reach the position. The mathematics were straightforward. The problem was also straightforward, in the way that the worst problems are. American soldiers were still in that sector, some confirmed alive, some not yet confirmed. He did not have time for certainty. He had time for probability. He could call fire and accept the risk of American casualties from his own rounds. He could withhold fire and accept the certain continued suppression of the sector reestablishment, which meant the perimeter remained partially breached, and the 272nd's next assault wave could exploit it before the relief column arrived. Neither option was clean. The field artillery operated at distance precisely because it operated without the ability to distinguish between individual figures at the point of impact. What Vessey was being asked to decide was not a targeting problem. It was a moral problem that had a targeting solution. He knew what his guns could do. He had spent 20 years learning exactly what his guns could do and what they could not. He also knew, with the specific earned knowledge of a man who had watched men die at Anzio as a teenager, what happened when a perimeter broke and the enemy came through it in numbers. He had seen that outcome before, in different terrain, in a different war. He knew which of the two choices was survivable for the base and which was not. He also knew that the soldiers in the northeastern sector did not know what was being calculated on their behalf in the fire direction center. They were fighting. They trusted the guns. What do? Not in a classroom. Not with 48 hours to write an ethics paper on the responsibilities of fire support coordination. Right now, the radio is in your hand. Your crews are looking at you. The 30 seconds you have are almost gone. You know what is in that sector. You know what is moving toward the perimeter again from the tree line. You know what happens to the 3 battalions in the jungle if the base falls completely. You know what a beehive round looks like when it arrives at a human target at close range. You carry all of that knowledge simultaneously, and none of it makes the choice easier, because knowledge and decision are not the same thing. This is the moment that separates the calculation from the cost. The textbook from the thing the textbook cannot contain. You think about the name at the top of the first page of the notebook in your chest pocket. You think about 20 years of Every Man Goes Home. You think about the men in the northeastern sector who trusted you specifically, who are fighting in a position that you are now considering placing rounds into. You think about what trust costs when it is held by someone who has to make decisions like this one. You have no clean answer. You have a radio. You have 30 seconds. The decision is yours. He called fire. The rounds went in. The Viet Cong position in the northeastern bunker complex was destroyed. The American soldiers who had been in that sector, the ones who were still mobile, had moved far enough during the decision's 30 seconds that the rounds fell on the enemy position and not on them. Whether this resulted from a radio transmission someone had managed to transmit, or from a platoon sergeant who had made a decision without explicit orders, or from the specific luck that attaches itself to certain moments in certain fights, Vessey would never be fully certain. What he knew, in the immediate aftermath, was that the northeastern perimeter was reestablished. The breach was closed. The perimeter was whole, and the relief column had just been reported approaching the Soi Samat. He had made a promise when he took command. Every man goes home, whatever it takes. He had kept it as fully as the situation allowed, which was not the same as completely, and he knew the difference between those two things, and he would carry the difference for the rest of his life. The notebook was still in his chest pocket, still with the name at the top of the first page, still blood-stained at the corner. The choice was made. The consequences were still being counted. But the guns were operational, and 17 miles away in the jungle, 3 American battalions who did not know what had just been decided in the Fire Direction Center of Firebase Gold were still alive to not know it. The 2nd Battalion, 34th Armor, crossed the Soi Samat without maps, without a charted ford, on orders from Colonel Marshall Garth that allowed for no ambiguity whatsoever. If a vehicle throws a track, leave it. Let's get in there and relieve the force. The stream crossing was improvised in real time. Vehicle commanders using compasses and experience and the particular judgment that develops only in men who have crossed contested terrain in tracked vehicles under time pressure. Lead elements found a crossing point and committed to it before it was fully assessed. The near bank was soft. Several vehicles struggled. None stopped. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Julian, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 22nd Infantry, mechanized, had moved his unit north on a trail that his scout platoon had cleared the previous afternoon, then swung east to search for the ford. His column was moving in terrain that had not been fully reconnoitered, toward a fire base he had never approached from this direction, under the standing order that time was the one resource that could not be recovered. When the lead elements broke through the tree line on Gold's southern perimeter at approximately 0900, they brought with them something that went beyond additional firepower, proof of the most fundamental military promise, the one that precedes all tactical doctrine and all operational planning. Someone was coming. They had come. The infantry and armored crews who entered Gold's perimeter that morning crossed from one kind of fight into another in the space of seconds. Outside the perimeter, they had been a relief column moving through contested terrain. Inside, they were suddenly in the middle of a close-quarters battle that had been ongoing for over 2.5 hours and that had not fully resolved in all sectors. The newly arrived armor, M48 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers, began moving around the perimeter, engines running, searchlights and headlights illuminating the smoke-covered ground, weapons firing continuously. The artillerymen who had been serving howitzers and the infantrymen who had been holding the wire and the armored crews who had just crossed an uncharted stream found themselves operating together in a space that was simultaneously too small, too crowded, and exactly what the situation required. The armored vehicles moved continuously throughout the sweep, which was their specific tactical advantage in close terrain. A tracked vehicle in motion is a harder target for rocket-propelled grenades than one that sits still, and the movement itself created a psychological and physical pressure that assault waves in the open ground could not sustain. Colonel Garth, orbiting overhead, directed the armor to sweep the entire perimeter circuit, not just the breach points, but the complete ring of Gold's wire, pushing remaining enemy elements into the killing ground created by the combination of the armor's external weapons and Vessey's guns, still firing from the center of the base. Vessey kept the guns firing throughout the armored sweep. His crews had been at their howitzers for more than 3 hours. Some of them had been wounded. Several had transitioned during the breach, from serving the guns to defending them with personal weapons when Viet Cong fighters came within direct sight of the artillery positions, and then transitioned back to serving the guns when the breach was closed. This was not what artillerymen were trained to do. It was not in the field artillery's occupational categories. It was the specific improvisation that combat demands when situations exceed the frameworks training provides for. The guns kept firing because the men who served them chose to keep serving them under conditions that gave them every legitimate reason to do otherwise. The artillerymen of the 2nd Battalion, 77th Field Artillery, expended more than 1,000 rounds during the battle, the majority in direct fire, at ranges that violated standard artillery doctrine on safe minimum distances and fuse settings. The 30 beehive rounds fired represented the largest single engagement expenditure of that ammunition type in the war to that point. These numbers would appear in after-action reports and historical analyses and the published record of Operation Junction City. What would not appear in those documents, what after-action reports are structurally unable to record, was the experience of loading and firing a howitzer at point-blank range while enemy fighters were visible through the weapon's sights. That experience belonged to the crews. It did not transfer to paper. The theme of the morning had been establishing itself for 3 hours, and by 0930 it had become clear enough to name. It was not about numerical advantage. The 272nd had the numbers. It was not about the sophistication of the tactical plan. The 272nd had planned with professional precision. It was not about courage. Both sides had demonstrated courage that day in quantities that deserved recognition. It was about something simpler and harder than any of those things. Refusing to stop doing what you were there to do, regardless of what was being done to you. Keep the guns firing. That was what the morning had required. That was what the morning had received. Not because an order mandated it at every moment, but because the men in the gun positions had internalized it until it was no longer a directive, but a fact about themselves. The 272nd's fighters, who remained on the field by 0930, understood that the window had closed. The assault plan had been built on speed and volume, overwhelming the perimeter before the defenders could adapt, before air support could coordinate, before an armored relief column could close the distance. The adaptation had come. The armor had come. The artillery had not stopped. The specific window the 272nd's commanders had calculated was real, and their fighters had come within a genuine margin of making it work. The fighters who could withdraw did so, moving back into the tree line with the practiced dispersal of soldiers who have learned to treat retreat as a tactical option rather than a failure. They moved without dishonor. They had done what they came to do, to the fullest extent the situation allowed, and they had the professional clarity to recognize when the situation had changed irreversibly. The 3 American battalions in the jungle had been monitoring Gold's radio traffic throughout the morning. When the transmission patterns shifted, when emergency fire requests gave way to routine coordination, they understood what had happened. The guns were still operational. The promise of fire support was intact. None of them knew yet what it had cost to keep it intact. They would learn that later. The cost was still being tallied when the armored vehicles completed their final circuit of Gold's perimeter, and the smoke from the fires inside the base rose straight into a sky that had been blue all morning and had stayed blue, indifferent, throughout everything that had happened beneath it. Victory came, but the cost was still being counted. The after-action reports record 31 Americans killed in action and 109 wounded. On the Viet Cong side, 647 confirmed dead were found in and around the perimeter, with an unknown number of additional casualties withdrawn before the armored sweep completed. 3 howitzers were damaged or destroyed. An ammunition dump had burned. These numbers, arranged in columns in an official report, carry the neutral quality of accounting, an exchange of resources recorded by people who were not present when the resources were expended. They are accurate. They are also insufficient. Among the 31 were young men who had been alive at 0600 and were not alive at 1000, and each of them had a name and a hometown and a family that would receive a notification that would arrive at a specific door on a specific morning and change everything that door opened onto for the rest of that family's life. Composites of those men appear in the casualty records of March 21, 1967. Soldiers in their late teens and early 20s, some in country for months, some for weeks, some scheduled to rotate out soon. They had gotten up that morning and done their jobs. That fact is both complete and insufficient as a description of anything. On the Viet Cong side, the bodies in and around the perimeter belonged to men who had traveled hundreds of miles through difficult terrain to reach this position, who had rehearsed the assault for days with a discipline that would have impressed any professional military observer, who had said goodbye to people they loved without being able to say where they were going or when they would return. Some of them had photographs in their uniform pockets, the same photographs, framed differently, that American soldiers carried in theirs. The military practice of searching enemy dead for intelligence documents means that some of these photographs passed through American hands on the afternoon of March 21st, and the Americans who held them understood briefly and without comfort what they were holding. By mid-morning, the guns had stopped, and the base was quiet in the specific way that a place is quiet after prolonged violence, not peaceful, but emptied. The cordite smell had thickened into something that sat in the throat and declined to leave. The ground around the northeastern breach had been churned by vehicle treads and boot prints and the impact of rounds until it was unrecognizable as the same soil that had been there before first light. Fires that had started during the initial barrage were still burning in two places, sending thin columns of smoke straight up into a sky that was clear and hot and offered no commentary on what had happened under it. Somewhere in the base, Vessey noticed it without consciously registering it. A bird had started again. Not loudly, just started, the way birds do when they have decided the worst is over. The medics moved through the base with the systematic urgency that their training produced, not running but not walking. The triage process sorted wounded into categories that civilian medicine does not require, and that anyone who has not served struggles to hold without discomfort: immediate, delayed, expectant. The expectant category is a medical and logistical calculation that functions simultaneously as a moral weight carried by everyone who participates in it. The dust-off helicopters were already inbound. Their rotors came through the smoke and the quiet before the aircraft were visible, the sound arriving ahead of everything else, which is what arrival sounds like when it matters most. The notebook in Vessey's chest pocket was blood-stained at the corner and bent from where it had been pressed hard against him during one of the closer impacts. He noticed this when he finally sat down, approximately 40 minutes after the last active firing. He did not open it immediately. He held it in his hand for a moment. Then he opened it and confirmed that the name at the top of the first page was still legible. It was. In the hours after the battle, Vessey moved through the base accounting for his battalion. He spoke with crew commanders. He reviewed damage to gun positions. He confirmed ammunition expenditures and requested resupply. These were the tasks the situation required and his position demanded, and he performed them with the focus that 20 years of training produced. What he did not do, could not do, in an operational environment where the all-clear had not formally been given, was process what had happened to him personally. The specific weight of the decision in the Fire Direction Center. The specific faces of the men who had died in the northeastern sector during the minutes that decision was being made. The specific knowledge that 31 men who had been alive at the beginning of the morning were not alive at the end of it. That weight was present. He carried it. He continued working. 40 years after Firebase Gold, John Vessey would speak in interviews about the artillery, the beehive rounds, the discipline of his crews, the specific mechanics of direct fire at close range. He would not often speak about the decision in the Fire Direction Center. Some experiences do not translate cleanly into the interview format, because the format implies that events have shapes that can be summarized and that retrospective clarity is available to those who lived through the original moment. What Vessey understood about the morning of March 21, 1967, was not clean or summarizable. It was specific and heavy and accurate and his. The notebook stayed with him. He never replaced it. The name at the top of the first page remained legible for the rest of his life. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to years. The weight did not get lighter. It got more familiar, which is a different thing entirely. John Vessey came home from Vietnam and continued serving. He rose through the general officer ranks with the qualities that had made him effective at Firebase Gold: technical precision, genuine concern for the people under his command, and the specific authority of a man who had been tested at close range and had not looked for an exit. In 1982, President Reagan appointed him the 10th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military position in the United States. The 17-year-old private who had enlisted because there was no other obvious path had become his country's senior officer, responsible for advising the President and the Secretary of Defense on military matters affecting a nation of 230 million people. The arc of that life is the kind of arc that invites easy narratives about service and achievement. Vessey himself resisted the easy narrative. In interviews and public statements throughout his post-service years, he spoke about military command with precision about the weight of it rather than the glory. He was, by all accounts, a man who had not resolved the morning of March 21st by filing it in the past. He had resolved it by carrying it forward, by taking the specific knowledge of what decisions cost and using it as the foundation for every subsequent decision. When he sat in the chairman's office in the Pentagon, he was not an abstraction. He was a man who had stood at a fire direction center with a radio in his hand and 30 seconds and no clean answer, and who had lived in the specific aftermath of the answer he gave. In 1987, President Reagan sent Vessey to Hanoi as a special emissary, the first senior American official to engage the Vietnamese government directly on the POW and MIA issue. He went. He met with Vietnamese officials. He negotiated on behalf of American families who had been waiting for answers about sons and husbands who had gone to Vietnam and not come home. He worked on that issue in various capacities for years. The conviction that had carried him through Firebase Gold, every man goes home, whatever it takes, had not retired when he did. John Vessey served honorably. The artillerymen of the 2nd Battalion, 77th Field Artillery, served honorably. The infantrymen who held the perimeter served honorably. The armored crews who crossed an uncharted stream on an order that allowed no hesitation served honorably. And the fighters of the 272nd Viet Cong Regiment, the men who came out of the tree line in the daylight, who had rehearsed for days, who believed with complete sincerity in what they were fighting for. They served honorably too, in every sense the word allows. The morning of March 21, 1967, was a tactical American success. Firebase Gold held. The mission continued. The 3 battalions in the jungle retained their fire support and completed their operations. What it was not was a resolution of anything larger, not of the war, not of the deeper conflict, not of the political decisions that had placed 2,500 Viet Cong fighters and several hundred Americans in the same stretch of jungle with orders to kill each other. The courage at Firebase Gold was real. The skill was real. The sacrifice was real. The question that honest history requires us to ask, not to diminish any of that, but alongside all of it, is whether the people who ordered Junction City, who reported its results upward through a command structure that had institutional incentives to find success, brought that same quality of commitment and honesty to their own decisions. The warriors did their part. The question is whether the policy deserved the warriors. War creates heroes on all sides. It creates loss on all sides. The courage of the men who kept the guns firing at Firebase Gold does not diminish the courage of the men who crossed the wire to silence them. Both can be true. Both should be remembered. Somewhere in Vietnam today, elderly men carry their own account of that morning. The assault that nearly succeeded, the window that closed before it could be exploited, the specific experience of surviving a fight in which many of the men around them did not survive. They deserve the same acknowledgement we extend to the men on the other side of the wire. They earned it the same way. John Vessey died in 2020 at 91 years old, having served his country for more than half a century in uniform and several years beyond it. The notebook, if it survived, if he kept it, which the available record does not say, would have had the name at the top of the first page still legible after all of it. Keep the guns firing. That was what the morning of March 21st required. That was what the morning of March 21st received. The cost of providing it was 31 men who did not see the afternoon, and one man who carried what those 31 had left behind through every afternoon that followed for 53 years. If you served or knew someone who served, their sacrifice was real. Their courage was real. Subscribe and join those who refuse to forget. Share this story if you believe these experiences deserve to be kept. And remember, honor the warriors, question the wars. The guns at Firebase Gold kept firing. The least we can do is keep telling the story of the men who kept them firing.